Real GDP per capita is a metric to estimate a nation's standard of living adjusted for inflation. It's often expressed in US dollars for each nation around the world. The formula for real GDP per capita is real GDP divided by a nation's population. So let's take a real easy example. Suppose the GDP for a nation is equal to $150 million, and that nation has a population equal to 10,000. Dividing those two numbers give us a GDP per capita equal to
$15,000.
Estimates of GDP per capita can vary depending on the source. The following data from the Madison Data Project uses a weighted population average. So let's take a look at a few countries around the world and what their GDP per capita is. Qatar has the highest GDP per capita on the planet of $140,000. Compare that to the US GDP per capita, which is $50,000 and one of the wealthiest nations on the planet. Japan, Russia, Mexico. Mexico has a GDP per capita that's slightly above the world's average. Many nations on the planet have GDP per capitas that are below the world average. For example, South Africa, Cuba, Haiti, which is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and Liberia, an African nation that's among the poorest on the planet, a GDP per capita of $761 is equal to about $2 per day for each person. GDP per capita allows economists to compare the prosperity of nations with different size populations. While China has the second highest GDP on the planet, their GDP per capita is lower than the world's average because they have such a large population. There are problems with the metric of GDP per capita. While it's an estimate for well-being is subjective, and it's based on all sorts of other factors, such as access to leisure, clean water, air, and freedom, numbers that aren't necessarily captured in GDP. It also doesn't account for income inequality. While the U.S. has a very high GDP per capita, within the U.S. there are some fabulously wealthy people and people who are quite poor too. Nevertheless, GDP per capita is a metric that helps examine a central question of economics. Why do some nations have a high GDP per capita, and why do some nations lag behind?